The dining room looked like it belonged in a luxury magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows, gray sole skyline, crystal glasses catching morning light across a 12-seat marble table almost nobody ever used. That morning, every seat was filled. Nobody touched their food. 7-year-old Kang Soo-yeon sat at the far end in her school uniform, staring at a bowl of seaweed soup that had gone cold. Her spoon hadn't moved in 23 minutes. Her father, Kang Min-jae, checked his watch, then his phone. 3 missed calls from Tokyo, 2 board messages, 1 article about his company's falling stock price. He rubbed his forehead. "Eat before it gets cold," he said, eyes still on the screen, no response. Across from him, his wife, Lee Ji-yoon, tried softer. "Soo-yeon! Sweetheart." The little girl didn't blink. Min-jae finally looked up properly. That's when he noticed it. His daughter's eyes weren't angry. They were searching, slowly, anxiously, like she was waiting for someone to walk through the door. Then she asked quietly, "Where is the African lady?" The entire room froze. Even the staff stopped moving. Set down her chopsticks carefully. Min-jae's jaw tightened. "Hannah doesn't work here anymore," he said flatly. Soo-yeon stared at him, not crying, not reacting. "Just still as in today?" He nodded once. "She won't be coming back." The little girl looked back at her food. For a moment, the room almost relaxed. Then she pushed the bowl away. "I'm not eating." The next morning, the mansion felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful, empty. The kind of silence that made every small sound uncomfortable. The ticking clock near the staircase, the distant hum of the refrigerator, staff footsteps pretending everything was normal. Nothing inside the Kang household felt normal anymore. Soo-yeon had finally fallen asleep inside Hana's old room, around 3 in the morning, still clutching the gray sweater. Ji-yeon carried her back upstairs herself. The child never woke, but even asleep, her fingers refused to let go of the fabric. Ji-yoon noticed that immediately, and for some reason, it unsettled her more than the crying. Downstairs, Min-jae stood alone at the kitchen island, holding untouched coffee, tie loose around his neck, exhausted before the day had even started. House manager Park Yoon-sil approached carefully. "She should see a child therapist again." Min-jae frowned. "She already completed therapy last year." Yoon-sil hesitated. "No, sir. I don't think she completed anything." That answer irritated him more than it should have. Ji-yeon entered before he could respond. "She finally slept," she said softly. "Good." Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Ji-yoon asked the question both of them had been avoiding. "Did we make a mistake?" Min-jae hardened immediately. "She crossed boundaries. She cared about our daughter. She became emotionally dependent on her." Ji-yoon looked down. The painful part was, that wasn't entirely untrue. Because over 2 years, everyone inside the house had slowly begun orbiting around Hana without noticing it. It started with small things, Soo-yeon refusing bedtime stories unless Hana read them, panicking when Hana took a day off, asking Hana before asking her own parents. At first it looked harmless, convenient even. The child smiled more around Hana, spoke more, ate better, laughed. And in a household where both parents were constantly busy, that felt like relief, until it didn't. 3 months earlier, winter. Snow fell quietly outside, while 7-year-old Soo-yeon sat beneath the dining table with her knees pressed to her chest. Another panic episode, the 3rd that month. 2 doctors called it residual childhood anxiety. One called it attachment instability. Min-jae called it stress. Ji-yoon called it exhaustion. Only Hana knelt on the floor beside the table, without trying to force the child out. She simply sat there, waiting, patient. "Still, you found me," Soo-yeon whispered eventually. Hana smiled. "You weren't hiding very well." A tiny laugh escaped the child, barely audible. Hana slowly slid a small flashlight across the floor toward her. "The power went out in Lagos all the time when I was little. My brother and I used to pretend flashlights were tiny suns." Soo-yeon stared at the flashlight, then whispered, "You scared? All the time. What did you do?" Hana shrugged lightly. "We stayed together until the fear got tired." The child thought about that seriously. Then she slowly reached for Hana's hand. Not dramatic, not emotional, natural, like breathing. From the hallway, Ji-yoon watched silently. Something complicated moved across her face. Relief, jealousy, guilt. Maybe all three, because no matter how hard she tried lately, she could not reach her daughter the way Hannah could. Hannah never acted like she belonged in the mansion. That was why the staff respected her. She spoke politely, kept emotional distance from adults, never overstepped professionally. But with Su Yun, something softened naturally. Every evening she waited outside school, holding a small yellow umbrella. Every night, she checked under the bed before turning off the lights. Every morning she braided the child's hair while teaching her random Nigerian words. Say it again, Su Yun giggled one morning. Jollof rice, jollof almost, jollof. Hannah laughed quietly. That was terrible, the child gasped. You're rude. From across the kitchen, even the staff smiled. Those moments felt warm, human, real. And maybe that was the problem. Because somewhere along the way, Hannah stopped feeling like an employee inside the house. Not fully family, but no longer invisible either. And wealthy families often become uncomfortable when staff begin occupying emotional space money cannot control. One evening, Min-jae came home unusually early. The mansion was dim except for soft light from the living room. He loosened his tie walking inside, then stopped. Soo-yun had fallen asleep on the couch. Her head rested against Hannah's shoulder. A children's book lay open across Hannah's lap. Hannah sat up immediately when she noticed him. I'm sorry, sir. She refused to sleep upstairs tonight. Min-jae stared at his daughter for a long moment. Peaceful. Completely peaceful. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her sleep without tension in her face. She likes you, he said quietly. Hannah looked down at the sleeping child. She likes feeling safe. That answer stayed with him longer than he expected. Because he suddenly realized something uncomfortable. He didn't know what made his daughter feel safe. He knew her allergies, her school schedule, her medications, but not that, not emotionally. Hannah carefully lifted Soo-yun into her arms. The child curled closer without waking. Min-jae watched silently as Hannah carried her upstairs. And for the first time in years, he felt strangely unnecessary inside his own home. The real shift happened at Soo-yun's birthday dinner. A formal event. Business partners, relatives, luxury decorations, photographers, everything perfectly curated. Except Soo-yun hated every second of it. She barely touched her cake, barely smiled for photos. Halfway through dinner, one of Min-jae's relatives glanced toward Hannah, refilling juice nearby. You hired her recently? The woman asked casually. Before Min-jae could answer, Soo-yun spoke. She takes care of me. The relative smiled politely. Well, that's her job. Soo-yun frowned immediately. No, she said seriously. She stays when people leave. The table went quiet. Ji-yun's expression changed first. Then Min-jae's. Hannah herself froze slightly near the drinks table. Because everyone understood what the child actually meant, and nobody knew how to respond. That night, Ji-yun stood alone in front of the bathroom mirror, removing her jewelry slowly. Min-jae entered behind her. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, do you think she's replacing us? Min-jae sighed. She's a caregiver. She's becoming more than that. What exactly are you accusing her of? Ji-yun looked frustrated with herself more than anyone. I don't know, but deep down she did know. She wasn't afraid Hannah would steal money, or status, or influence. She was afraid her daughter already loved someone else more, and that fear made her ashamed of herself. Late that same night, Hannah tucked Soo-yun into bed. The child looked unusually thoughtful. Hannah? Yes? Do people always leave after they promise not to? The question came so suddenly it caught Hannah off guard. She sat carefully beside the bed. Why are you asking that? Soo-yun shrugged beneath the blanket. Everybody gets busy. The room became painfully quiet. Because children rarely describe abandonment dramatically. Usually, they describe it practically. Hannah brushed hair gently away from the child's forehead. I'm here right now, she whispered. Soo-yun stared at her for several seconds, then finally closed her eyes. But before falling asleep, she whispered something so quietly Hannah almost missed it. You're my safe place. Outside the slightly open bedroom door, Ji-yun stood frozen in the hallway, listening. And for the first time since Hannah entered their lives, Fear truly settled inside her chest. For the next few days, nobody inside the Kang household said Hannah's name out loud. Not at the dining table, not in the hallways, not even among the staff. But her absence sat inside the mansion like a missing wall, visible everywhere, especially to Su Yun. The little soul stopped talking during meals almost completely. She answered questions with nods. Sometimes not even that. At school, teachers reported she kept staring at the classroom door whenever footsteps passed outside. At night, she began sleeping with the hallway light on again, a habit she had abandoned nearly a year earlier. Ji-yoon noticed quietly. Min-jae noticed too. But both parents responded differently. Ji-yoon watched with growing guilt. Min-jae watched with growing irritation. Because deep down, he believed this should have already passed. Children adapt. Children forget. Children move on, at least, that was what he told himself. Every morning proved him wrong. One Thursday evening, Min-jae returned home after a disastrous board meeting to find another untouched dinner waiting at the table. Soo-yun sat silently beside a bowl of cold rice. Ji-yoon looked exhausted already. She ate 3 strawberries today, she said quietly. That's all. Min-jae loosened his cuffs. This has gone too far. She's grieving, she's manipulating. Ji-yoon looked at him sharply. She's 7, and she's learning this behavior works. Before Ji-yoon could answer, Soo-yun stood from her chair. Not angry, just done listening. She walked upstairs without touching her food. Min-jae stared after her. You see? Every boundary disappears when you reward emotional dependency. Ji-yoon's voice lowered dangerously. And whose fault is that? Silence. The question lingered longer than either of them expected. Meanwhile, across the city, Hannah sat alone inside a small apartment above her brother Daniel's restaurant. Modest, warm lighting, second-hand furniture, tiny kitchen, nothing like the Kang mansion. Yet for the first time in years, the silence around her belonged entirely to her. No panic monitors, no luxury schedules, no hidden tension beneath polished floors, just quiet. Daniel placed a plate of food in front of her. You barely touched lunch. I'm not hungry. That little girl still refusing to eat? Hannah looked surprised. You think I don't know? Daniel sighed. You've checked your phone every 6 minutes since yesterday. Hannah lowered her eyes. Daniel sat across from her carefully. You should have left that house months ago. I know. They were using you emotionally. That's not fair, Hannah. His tone softened. You always stay too long where people only value you when they need saving. That sentence hits somewhere deep, because part of her feared he was right. Not about Soo-yun, never the child, but the adults. The emotional burden had slowly become invisible labor. Nobody acknowledged anymore. Every panic attack, every sleepless night, every emotional collapse, handled quietly by her. And somehow the family began treating her emotional presence as permanent infrastructure instead of sacrifice. Daniel leaned back. Did the father even thank you when he fired you? Hannah said nothing. That answer was enough. Back at the mansion, pressure slowly transformed into embarrassment. One Saturday evening, Ji-yoon hosted a private gallery dinner for investors and acquaintances. Everything appeared perfect on the surface. Elegant dresses, expensive wine, controlled smiles. But halfway through the evening, one guest asked casually, So where's the foreign nanny? Your daughter used to follow her everywhere. Ji-yoon's face tightened. She no longer works with us. Another woman laughed lightly. Honestly, that attachment was becoming noticeable. Ji-yoon forced a polite smile, but the conversation continued. You have to be careful with household staff. Children confuse affection with authority, especially when parents are busy. Each sentence sounded harmless individually. Together, they felt humiliating. Ji-yoon excused herself shortly afterward. Upstairs, she found Soo-yun hiding beneath the staircase reading one of Hannah's old storybooks. The child looked up immediately. Is she back? Ji-yoon's heart sank. No, Soo-yun lowered her eyes. Ji-yoon sat beside her slowly. You still have us. The little girl stared at the floor for several seconds, then quietly asked, Are you staying tomorrow? Ji-yoon froze, because she suddenly realized something devastating. Her daughter genuinely didn't expect consistency from her anymore. Not emotionally, not physically. Nothing about the question sounded accusing. That was what hurt most. It sounded normal. Ji-yoon swallowed hard. Yes, she whispered. But even she heard the uncertainty inside her own voice. The following week, Min-jae's mother visited unexpectedly. An elegant older woman, sharp posture, colder eyes than her son. She noticed the tension immediately. Something is wrong with the child, she observed during tea. She's adjusting, Min-jae replied shortly. His mother glanced toward Soo-yun sitting quietly near the window. She barely looks at either of you. Ji-yoon shifted uncomfortably. Then the older woman asked the question nobody wanted to answer. Where is the African woman? Min-jae exhaled. We let her go. His mother studied him carefully. And the child collapsed afterward. Neither answered. That silence said enough. The older woman stirred her tea slowly. You removed the wrong person from the house. Min-jae frowned immediately. She was becoming emotionally inappropriate. No, his mother said calmly. She became emotionally necessary. The distinction irritated him deeply, because somewhere underneath his frustration, he knew she might be right. That night, Soo-yun experienced another panic episode, smaller than before, but worse emotionally. Ji-yoon found her sitting on the bathroom floor trembling silently. No screaming, no crying, just shaking. Honey? Soo-yun wouldn't look at her. Ji-yun sat beside her carefully. What's wrong? The little girl whispered so softly it barely sounded real. I can't hear her, Ji-yoon blinked. What? Her voice. The child pressed her hands against her ears. She always talks when it gets bad. Ji-yoon's chest tightened painfully. Because this wasn't spoiled behavior. This wasn't manipulation. This was emotional dependence built carefully over years. And suddenly, Ji-yoon understood something horrifying. Hana had become part of her daughter's emotional regulation system, without anyone stopping it. Without anyone noticing how deep it had gone, Ji-yoon pulled Soo-yun gently into her arms. At first the child stayed stiff, uncertain. Then slowly, carefully, she leaned back. Ji-yoon nearly cried from relief. But the moment lasted only seconds, because Soo-yun whispered against her shoulder, You don't smell like home. The sentence shattered something inside her. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. The next morning, Min-jae stepped into the elevator reviewing financial reports on his tablet. But his mind kept drifting, to the drawings, to the panic attacks, to the words, safe place. His assistant hesitated before speaking. Sir, there's also the matter of the caregiver severance papers. Min-jae looked up. What about them? She refused the additional compensation package. That surprised him. Most former employees accepted immediately. What reason did she give? The assistant checked the notes awkwardly. She said, I was never there for the money. The elevator fell silent. For the first time since firing Hana, genuine discomfort crept into Min-jae's chest. Not guilt yet, but something close. Because suddenly the entire situation looked different. Less professional, more personal, and that frightened him. Late that evening, Park Yun-sil entered Soo-yun's room carrying folded laundry. The child sat quietly on the carpet drawing. What are you making? The older woman asked gently. Soo-yun hesitated, then turned the paper around. 3 figures holding hands. 1 small child. 1 woman with dark curly hair. And beside them empty space, no parents. Yoon-sil carefully lowered herself into the nearby chair. Soo-yun, the child spoke without looking up. Do people disappear when you love them too much? The question nearly broke the older woman's heart. Because children always blame themselves first. Always. Yoon-sil looked toward the hallway quietly, then back at the child. No, she whispered carefully. Sometimes adults disappear because they don't understand how important they are. Soo-yun stared at the drawing silently, then finally asked the question nobody in that house was prepared for. Why didn't Daddy know she was keeping me okay? That question followed Min-jae for days, even though he never actually heard Soo-yun ask it. Park Yoon-sil never repeated the conversation directly. But somehow the feeling behind it spread through the house anyway. Why didn't Daddy know? At first, Min-jae buried himself deeper in work. Meetings, press interviews, investor dinners. Numbers. Numbers were easier than emotions. Numbers behaved logically, people didn't. Children especially. But late at night, when the mansion finally quieted, he kept noticing things he had ignored before. Tiny details. Su Yun no longer ran toward the front door when he came home. She stopped asking when her mother would return from events. She barely touched the piano she used to love. Instead, she replayed voice recordings. Over and over. Soft recordings hidden beneath her blanket at night. One evening, Min-jae passed her bedroom door and paused. Hannah's voice drifted faintly through the speakers. Okay, close your eyes. A small pause. Now tell me 5 things you can hear. Another pause. That's good, silence. You're safe right now. Min-jae stood completely still outside the door. The recording sounded calm, gentle, precise, not like a nanny entertaining a child. Like someone guiding her through fear. Inside the room, Su Yun whispered the answers quietly to herself. The rain, the air conditioner, the clock, your voice. The last answer almost made Min-jae step inside. But he didn't, because suddenly he felt like an outsider listening to something deeply private. The following morning, Ji-yoon visited Soo-yoon's school after another call from the counselor. She's withdrawing socially again. Ji-yoon's stomach tightened. She was improving before. She was, the counselor agreed gently. But emotionally regulated children don't collapse this quickly unless a major attachment figure disappears. The phrase attachment figure unsettled Ji-yoon immediately. Not nanny, not caregiver, attachment figure. She talks about Hana constantly. Ji-yoon looked embarrassed. We're trying to help her adjust. The counselor hesitated. Can I be honest? Ji-yoon nodded slowly. I don't think this child is grieving an employee. The words sat heavily between them. Because deep down, Ji-yoon already knew that. That evening, Min-jae entered the library searching for old business documents. Instead, he found a slim medical folder hidden beneath several books. Soo-yun's name across the front. He frowned. The file should have been archived already. He opened it. Inside, therapy evaluations from 2 years earlier. Pages of notes. Child displays prolonged silence. Severe anxiety during separation. Avoids emotional communication with parents. Responds positively to caregiver Hana Okafor. Min-jae's expression slowly changed. He turned another page. Caregiver demonstrates advanced emotional grounding techniques. Patient calms significantly in caregiver presence. Another page. Hospital regression prevented after caregiver intervention. His chest tightened. What hospital regression? Why had nobody told him this? Then he saw the signature. Hana Okafor. Behavioral Pediatric Assistant Certification. Min-jae froze completely. Behavioral Pediatric Assistant? She never mentioned that during hiring. As he flipped through more documents, the pieces slowly rearranged inside his mind. The breathing exercises, the calm voice recordings, the panic management, the emotional consistency. This wasn't accidental caregiving. Hana had known exactly what she was doing, and somehow, he had never once asked about her background beyond basic employment paperwork. Across the city, Hana stood outside Daniel's restaurant after closing time, wrapping her coat tighter against the cold. Her phone vibrated again. Another missed call from the Kang residence. She ignored it. Daniel stepped outside carrying trash bags. They called again? Yes. You answerings? No. Daniel nodded approvingly. But Hannah didn't look relieved. She looked guilty. Because every ignored call made her imagine Soo-yun waiting near the window upstairs. And that image was becoming harder to survive. Daniel studied her quietly. You miss her. Hannah looked away immediately. That's not professional. That wasn't my question. Silence. Finally, she whispered, she thinks I left voluntarily. Daniel's expression softened. Did you say goodbye properly? Hannah shook her head once. No, why not? Her answer came painfully fast. Because if she cried, I wouldn't have left. Daniel said nothing after that. Because sometimes love becomes dangerous exactly when it feels pure. 2 nights later, Ji-yoon entered Soo-yun's room carrying folded pajamas. The child quickly hid something beneath her pillow. Ji-yoon noticed immediately. What's that? Nothing. Soo-yun! Reluctantly, the child pulled out a small voice recorder. Ji-yoon frowned. Where did you get this? Hana gave it to me. Just that answer alone made Ji-yoon's chest tighten. She pressed play accidentally while examining it. Hannah's voice filled the room softly. If you feel scared and I'm not nearby, listen carefully, okay? A tiny younger version of Soo-yeon answered, okay. First, breathe slowly, a pause. Second, remember, feelings move like weather. They don't stay forever. Tiny breathing sounds. Then Hannah asked gently, and third? Little Soo-yeon answered proudly, I'm not alone even when I feel alone. Ji-yeon stopped the recording. Her vision blurred unexpectedly, because she realized something horrifying. Hannah had been preparing the child emotionally for separation long before anyone else considered it, as if she always knew this day would eventually come. Ji-yoon sat slowly on the edge of the bed. How often do you listen to these? Soo-yeon shrugged. When it gets loud. What gets loud? The child touched her chest quietly. Ji-yoon nearly broke right there, because she had spent years assuming her daughter was simply quiet, when in reality, her daughter had been struggling silently, and someone else noticed first. The next major discovery came from Park Yoon-sil. Late one afternoon, she approached Min Jae carefully in his office. There's something you should probably know, sir. Min Jae looked up tiredly. What now? She placed a stack of appointment receipts on his desk. Therapy centers, child psychologists, hospital visits. Every payment signed privately by Hannah. Min Jae stared in confusion. These aren't company records. No, sir. Then why does she appear on them? Yoon-sil hesitated. Because many times she took Soo-yeon herself. Min Jae looked up sharply. What do you mean herself? You and Madam were often unavailable. The room went still. She said she didn't want to burden you during important business periods. Each sentence landed harder than the last. Min Jae leaned back slowly. When exactly was this happening? Mostly during the months after the hospitalization. Again, that word, Min Jae's voice lowered. What hospitalization? The older woman's face changed immediately. And in that instant, he realized something terrifying. There were parts of his daughter's emotional history he barely understood, because he had trusted reports instead of participation. Yoon-sil spoke carefully now. She stopped speaking for nearly 11 weeks after the surgery complication. Min Jae's stomach dropped. He remembered the surgery, the recovery, the specialists. But he also remembered missing most of it because of international expansion meetings. At the time, Ji-yoon handled the hospital schedules, or at least he thought she had. She wouldn't eat, Yoon-sil continued quietly. Wouldn't respond. Wouldn't sleep properly. Min Jae's voice barely worked. And Hannah? The older woman looked toward the window. She stayed. Just 2 words. But somehow they carried unbearable weight. That night, Min Jae finally confronted Ji-yoon. The moment she entered their bedroom, he held up the therapy files. What is this? Ji-yoon's face drained instantly. He rarely raised his voice. That made this worse. She helped during recovery, Ji said carefully. You told me Soo-yeon improved naturally. She eventually did, with Hannah. Ji-yeon looked exhausted suddenly. Yes, Min Jae paced once across the room. She attended therapy sessions? Yes. She managed panic episodes? Yes. She prevented hospitalization? Ji-yoon closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Min Jae stared at his wife like he no longer recognized her. Why didn't you tell me how serious things were? Ji-yeon laughed bitterly. Because you were never here long enough to ask. The sentence sliced through the room. And for once, Min Jae had no defense ready. Later that same night, Soo-yeon finally fell asleep after another anxious episode. Ji-yoon remained beside the bed, quietly watching her daughter breathe. Then she noticed something partially hidden beneath the blanket. A folded paper. She opened it carefully, a child's drawing, 3 figures again, Hannah, Soo-yeon, and an empty outline where another person should have been. This time, words were written beside the empty space. Daddy doesn't know me yet. Ji-yoon covered her mouth instantly. Tears came without warning, because for the first time, she understood the full damage. Their daughter had not emotionally replaced them. She had emotionally survived them. And downstairs, alone in his dark office, Kang Min Jae pressed play on another old voice recording. Soo-yeon's tiny voice echoed softly through the speakers. Hannah? Yes, if you leave. Who keeps me okay? A long silence. Then Hannah answered gently, "You'll learn someday that being loved and being abandoned are not the same thing." Minjae stared into the darkness after the recording ended, and for the first time since firing her, he felt something worse than guilt. Shame. Shame changed the atmosphere inside the Kang household faster than anger ever could. Because once Minjae understood what Hana had truly been doing for his daughter, every memory inside the mansion started looking different. The late-night panic episodes, the sudden calm after Hannah entered a room, the way Soo Yun instinctively searched for her first. None of it had been ordinary attachment. It had been survival. And somehow he had mistaken survival for disobedience. 3 days later, Minjae canceled an investor dinner for the first time in nearly 11 years. His executives were stunned. Jean noticed too. "You canceled?" I said I did. She stood near the kitchen counter, watching him attempt something unfamiliar. Making breakfast. The eggs were slightly burned, the toast uneven. But upstairs, Soo-yun smelled food and slowly appeared at the dining room entrance. She looked surprised seeing her father there instead of staff. Minjae straightened awkwardly. "I made breakfast." The child stared carefully at the plate, then at him. Why? The question hurt more than he expected. Because children only ask why when care feels unusual. Minjae forced a calm voice. "Because fathers should sometimes." Soo-yun didn't answer immediately. She sat down slowly, picked up the fork, took one bite. Minjae nearly looked relieved until she quietly asked, "Did Hannah teach you?" The relief disappeared instantly, lowered her eyes toward the sink. Even now, Hannah remained present in every emotional interaction, invisible but everywhere. Meanwhile, across Seoul, Hannah tried rebuilding a routine. Morning coffee, helping Daniel prepare ingredients, walking home through crowded streets without constantly checking the time for school pickup schedules. Normal life, yet nothing felt normal. Because for 2 years, her nervous system had quietly adjusted itself around one child's emotional needs. Now the absence felt physical. One afternoon, while organizing storage boxes, Hana found one of Soo-yun's old drawings accidentally packed inside her bag. A tiny stick figure holding hands with a taller woman beneath badly drawn stars. At the top, in shaky Korean handwriting, "Hana stays." Hana sat down slowly on the floor, then cried for the first time since leaving the mansion. Not loudly, not dramatically, just exhausted tears from someone who had spent too long pretending professionalism could erase emotional attachment. Downstairs, Daniel heard nothing, but when she eventually came down for dinner, her eyes told him enough. "She's getting worse, isn't she?" Hannah asked quietly. Daniel sighed. "You know you shouldn't ask me that. That's not a no." He leaned back carefully. "Hannah, you cannot build your life around saving one family." Her answer came almost immediately. It was never the family, just the child. And somehow that distinction made everything more dangerous. At the mansion, Ji-yoon finally entered Soo-yoon's room one evening, without her phone in her hand. No meetings, no gallery emails, no distractions, just presence. The child sat quietly drawing near the window. Ji-yoon lowered herself onto the carpet beside her. "What are you making?" Soo-yeon hesitated before turning the sketchbook slightly. This drawing looked different. Instead of people, she had drawn a house. But only one room inside had color, a tiny bedroom with yellow light. Ji-yoon recognized it instantly, Hannah's room. "You liked being there?" she asked softly. Soo-yeon nodded. "Why?" The child shrugged first, then whispered. "She listened before I became scared." Ji-yeon's chest tightened painfully. "Did mommy not listen?" Soo-yeon looked genuinely conflicted by the question. "You were busy." No accusation, no angst, just simpleness again. And somehow honesty hurt more than blame ever could. Ji-yeon looked slowly around the room. Expensive toys, designer furniture, beautiful decorations, everything money could provide. But suddenly the room felt emotionally hollow, because she finally understood something terrifying. Love had existed inside this house, but consistency had not. And children survive on consistency more than luxury. 2 days later, things became much worse. Soo-yeon refused school entirely. First she complained of stomach pain, then headaches, then silence. Finally, During morning preparations, she locked herself inside the bathroom and refused to come out. Ji-yoon crouched outside the door anxiously. Honey? No answer. Soo-yeon, please open the door. Several seconds passed. Then a tiny voice answered, if I go outside, people disappear. Ji-yoon closed her eyes instantly. That sentence carried too much fear for a 7-year-old. Min-jae arrived moments later, already frustrated from work calls. What's happening? She won't come out. He knocked once. Soo-yeon. Silence then. You fired my safe place. The words hit him like physical force. Because this time there was no screaming, no panic, just devastating clarity. Min-jae leaned his forehead briefly against the bathroom door. And, for the first time in years, he felt helpless inside his own house. That same afternoon, child specialists visited the mansion. One doctor spoke carefully after observing Soo-yeon for nearly an hour. She's displaying severe emotional destabilization connected to attachment rupture. Min-jae hated how clinical the words sounded. What exactly does that mean? It means someone emotionally central disappeared suddenly. Ji-yoon folded her arms tightly. She's attached to a former caregiver. The doctor looked at both parents quietly. With respect, children don't collapse like this over ordinary caregivers. The room went silent again, because everyone already knew that. The doctor continued carefully. She associated emotional safety with one consistent person for a prolonged period. Min-jae's voice hardened slightly. So what are you suggesting? Stability? A pause. And honesty. The doctor's eyes moved between both parents. Children know when adults are emotionally absent long before adults admit it. Those words lingered heavily after she left. Neither parent spoke for several minutes. Finally, Ji-yoon whispered, "We failed her." Min-jae stared out the window silently. The worst part was, he could no longer deny it. But pressure outside the house was building too. A business article leaked details about Min-jae's declining hotel expansion project. Online criticism intensified. Board members became aggressive. Investors demanded appearances. And for the first time, Min-jae found himself unable to separate corporate pressure from personal collapse. Because every interview felt fake now. Every polished public statement about leadership and family values sounded hollow in his own ears. One evening, while preparing for a televised appearance, he overheard 2 staff members whispering in the hallway. She hasn't smiled since Hannah left. I heard she doesn't sleep properly anymore. They should bring her back. Min-jae walked past silently. But the whispers followed him anyway, because deep down, he agreed. Later that night, Park Yoon-sil approached him quietly in the study. She drew something again, the older woman said. Min-jae rubbed tired eyes. What now? Yoon-sil handed him a folded paper. At first glance, it looked simple. A little girl standing between 2 doors, one door bright, one dark. Near the bright door stood Hannah. Near the dark door stood empty shadows labeled busy. Min-jae stared at the drawing for a very long time, then finally asked, why didn't anyone tell me how bad this was? Yoon-sil answered honestly, because everyone assumed someone else already had. That sentence hollowed the room instantly, because it perfectly described the entire household. Everyone delegated care emotionally, until eventually nobody fully carried it at all, except Hannah. The following morning, Min-jae finally opened the severance envelope Hannah had refused. Inside, he expected documents. Instead, a handwritten note folded carefully between the papers. Only 3 lines. Please do not let her believe people always leave when she becomes difficult. That fear already existed before me. Hannah, Min-jae read the note twice, then a 3rd time. His chest tightened harder with every word. Because suddenly he realized something unbearable. Hannah never defended herself after being fired, not once. Even now, her concern remained entirely focused on protecting Soo-yeon emotionally, not protecting herself. And that kind of selflessness made his decision look even uglier. That evening, the breaking point finally came. Dinner sat untouched again. Ji-yoon barely ate. Min-jae barely spoke. Soo-yeon quietly pushed rice around her plate without lifting her eyes. Then suddenly she asked, did Hannah cry when she left? Neither parent answered immediately, because neither of them knew. Soo-yeon nodded slowly, like the silence itself was enough. I think she did. Min-jae swallowed hard. The child continued softly. She cries quietly so people don't feel guilty. Ji-yoon looked away instantly. But Min-jae stared directly at his daughter. Because no 7-year-old should understand emotional suppression that well. Not unless she had spent years watching adults hide pain from each other. Soo-yeon stood slowly from the table, then asked the question that finally shattered whatever emotional distance remained between father and daughter. Daddy, her voice trembled slightly. Why didn't you know she was keeping me alive inside? The room went completely still. And for the first time in his entire life, Kang Min-jae had no idea how to answer a child honestly. Min-jae did not sleep that night. After Soo-yeon's question, he remained alone downstairs in the dark dining room long after everyone disappeared upstairs. The untouched dishes still sat on the table, cold, forgotten. He kept hearing the same sentence repeatedly inside his head. Why didn't you know she was keeping me alive inside? Not dramatic, not childish. Terrifyingly sincere, because children rarely exaggerate emotional truth. Adults do. Children say exactly what they feel. And for the first time, Min-jae realized his daughter had been emotionally drowning right in front of him, while he kept mistaking silence for stability. At 3:17 a.m., he entered his home office and opened every archived medical file connected to Soo-yeon's hospitalization. For nearly 2 hours, he read documents he should have read years earlier. Complication reports, behavioral assessments, sleep evaluations, and scattered throughout all of them, one name appeared constantly: Hana Okafor, assisted patient during panic regression. Patient stabilized after caregiver intervention. Caregiver remained overnight voluntarily. Voluntarily. Min-jae frowned harder. He checked payment records, no overtime requests, no additional compensation claims, no reimbursement submissions, nothing. She had stayed because she chose to, not because anyone asked her to. And somehow that realization felt heavier than accusation. The final document nearly stopped his breathing. Psychological risk evaluation. He opened it slowly. Patient exhibits severe fear of abandonment after prolonged hospitalization period. Primary emotional stabilization source: Hana Okafor. Risk if attachment removed abruptly. Acute emotional withdrawal, food refusal, anxiety escalation, dissociative behavior. Recommendation: transition separation gradually under therapeutic supervision. Min-jae stared motionlessly at the page, then at the date, 8 months ago. 8 entire months before he fired her in a single morning conversation. His hand slowly tightened around the paper, because suddenly his mistake no longer looked emotional. It looked negligent. Upstairs, Ji-yoon stood outside Soo-yoon's bedroom listening to soft, restless sounds from inside. The child was dreaming badly again, whispering fragmented sentences in her sleep. Don't go. I'll be good. Please stay. Ji-yoon covered her mouth instantly. The guilt was becoming unbearable now, because the more she remembered, the more obvious everything became. Hana had not inserted herself emotionally into their daughter's life. Their absence had created the space naturally, and Hana simply stayed where they repeatedly could not. Ji-yoon finally entered the room quietly. Soo-yeon twisted anxiously beneath the blankets. Without thinking, Ji-yoon sat beside her and gently brushed hair away from her forehead. The child calmed slightly, but even half asleep, Soo-yeon whispered, "Hannah?" Ji-yoon closed her eyes. That single word hurt more than any accusation ever could. The next morning, Min-jae requested a private meeting with Soo-yeon's former child therapist, Dr. Seo arrived cautiously, already aware something serious had changed. After brief formalities, Min-jae placed the psychological report on the desk. You knew this could happen. Dr. Seo remained calm. Yes, and nobody informed me. I attempted to. Min-jae frowned sharply. What does that mean? The therapist opened her tablet slowly. There were 6 requests for family sessions over the last year. Min-jae's expression changed. I never received those. Dr. Seo hesitated carefully. Your office declined most scheduling attempts due to travel conflicts. Silence. The room suddenly felt smaller. Min-jae leaned back slowly, because he realized something devastating. He had spent years believing he was unavailable temporarily. But emotionally, temporary absence, repeated long enough, simply becomes abandonment, Doctor. Seo continued gently. Mr. K? Children don't always need perfect parents. He looked exhausted already. Then what do they need? Emotionally predictable ones. That sentence followed him long after the meeting ended. Meanwhile, Hana received another call from the mansion. This time, she answered. Not because she felt ready. Because she feared something had happened. Park Yunsil's voice came softly through the phone. She's getting weaker. Hana immediately sat upright. What happened? She still eats very little. A pause. She asks for you every night. Hana shut her eyes tightly. You shouldn't have called me. I know. Then why did you? The older woman's voice cracked slightly. Because I think the child believes she was abandoned. Silence swallowed the line. Hana pressed trembling fingers against her forehead. That had always been the fear. Not leaving, but how leaving would feel to Soo-yeon emotionally. Hana spoke carefully. Does she hate them? No. That answer came immediately. She just doesn't trust permanence anymore. Hana's eyes filled slowly. Because trust, once damaged during childhood, rarely breaks loudly. Usually it erodes quietly, day after day, disappointment after disappointment, until eventually children stop expecting people to stay. That afternoon, Ji-yoon entered the storage room searching for old family albums. Instead, she found several sealed boxes labeled Hospital Recovery. Inside were coloring books, medication records, children's DVDs, and dozens of handwritten notes, most signed by Hana. Jian sat slowly on the floor while reading them. Soo-yeon ate half a banana today after panic episode. She smiled during music therapy. She slept 4 straight hours. She asked for her mother tonight. That line stopped Jian completely. She searched through more pages desperately. She cried after visiting hours ended. She waited near the door for her father, told her both parents loved her very much. Jian finally broke. Real tears, violent tears, because hidden between every progress report was the same quiet truth. Hana had spent months protecting their daughter emotionally from feeling unwanted. Even while Soo-yeon waited for parents who rarely stayed long enough, Jian covered her face. The guilt no longer felt abstract, it felt earned. That evening, Min-jae finally asked the question he had avoided for years. When exactly did Soo-yeon stop speaking? Jian looked startled. You remember that period? I remember parts. The honesty sounded pathetic even to him. Ji-yoon sat down slowly. It started after the surgery complication. Min-jae rubbed his forehead. She barely spoke for weeks. And Hana? She sat with her every single day. Ji-yoon's eyes lowered. She read books even when Soo-yeon gave no response. A pause. She talked to her like silence wasn't frightening. Min-jae stared blankly ahead, because he suddenly remembered one specific hospital visit. He had arrived late after an overseas conference. Soo-yeon refused to acknowledge him entirely. But nearby, Hana sat beside the bed quietly folding paper cranes while speaking softly about random things. At the time, he barely noticed. Now the memory looked completely different. Not casual caregiving, emotional rescue. Late that night, Min-jae entered Soo-yeon's room carrying a glass of water. The child sat awake beneath dim lighting. He sat carefully beside her. I talked to your doctor today. No response. Min-jae looked down at his hands. I think I missed many things. Soo-yeon stared quietly toward the window, then whispered. Hana noticed first. The simplicity of the sentence crushed him. Because she wasn't trying to punish him. She was explaining reality. Min-jae swallowed hard. Why didn't you tell me you were hurting? The child looked genuinely confused by the question. I did. Silence. Then softly, you were busy. The words landed exactly where they should. No anger, no blame, just truth. And truth spoken calmly is often far more painful than rage. The final reveal came unexpectedly the next morning. Park Yunsil entered Min-jae's office holding an old tablet recovered from storage. She recorded these during recovery. Min-jae frowned slightly. Recorded what? Progress journals. He opened the files slowly. Video after video appeared. Soo-yeon refusing meals. Soo-yeon trembling during storms. Soo-yeon staring silently at hospital walls. And in every clip, Hana remained there, patient, calm, steady. But one recording changed everything completely. A tiny hospital room, Late at night, Su Yun's sat crying uncontrollably after another nightmare. Hana held her gently while exhaustion covered her own face. Then the child asked through tears, "If I become difficult, will you leave too?" Hannah's expression shattered instantly. "No, but people get tired. I won't disappear because you're hurting." Tiny trembling breaths. Then Suyun whispered something barely audible. "If you leave, I disappear too." The recording ended. Minjae sat frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe properly, because suddenly he understood the full truth at last. His daughter attached to Hana so deeply because Hana became the only person who consistently stayed through fear instead of retreating from it. Not because Hana replaced her parents, because Hana remained present when emotional pain became inconvenient for everyone else. And downstairs, unnoticed by the staff, Kang Min-jae finally lowered his head into his hands. Not like a CEO losing control, like a father realizing someone else carried his child emotionally while he kept calling himself present. The next morning, Kang Min-jae canceled everything. Board meetings, investor calls, a television interview scheduled weeks earlier. His assistant sounded stunned over the phone. "Sir, the board is expecting you in Busan by noon. I won't be there." A long silence. Then carefully, "Should I reschedule?" Min-jae looked upstairs toward his daughter's room. "No." His voice sounded unfamiliar even to himself. "Tell them my family requires immediate attention." He ended the call before anyone could respond. For years he had treated emotional crises like temporary interruptions to real responsibilities. Now for the first time he understood. This was the real responsibility. An hour later, he stood outside Daniel Okafor's restaurant, the Cold Soul Drizzle. The restaurant hadn't opened yet. Workers moved inside preparing ingredients, while soft Afrobeat music drifted faintly through the kitchen entrance. Min-jae hesitated before stepping inside. Everything about the place felt different from his world. Warm, loud, human, not polished into emotional silence. Daniel noticed him immediately. His expression hardened instantly. "You," Min-jae bowed slightly. "I need to speak with Hannah." Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "Now you need her." Min-jae accepted the insult quietly. "I understand your anger." "No," Daniel interrupted sharply. "You understand inconvenience." "That's different." The kitchen staff wisely disappeared toward the back. Daniel folded his arms. "My sister gave everything to your child." Min-jae lowered his eyes briefly. "I know, and you fired her like an employee who overstepped." The sentence landed cleanly, precisely because it was true. Min-jae inhaled slowly. "I made a mistake." Daniel stepped closer. "No, a mistake is forgetting an appointment." His voice lowered dangerously. "You abandoned the one person holding your daughter together emotionally." Silence swallowed the room, because there was nothing to argue against. Nothing. Finally, Min-jae asked quietly, "Is she here?" Daniel studied him for several seconds, then answered honestly, "She doesn't want to see you." Upstairs in the small apartment above the restaurant, Hana stood motionless behind the door, listening to everything, every word, every silence. Her chest tightened painfully hearing Suyun described that way, holding your daughter together emotionally, because deep down, she feared it might be true. And that frightened her more than anyone understood. She never intended to become emotionally central in that child's life. It happened slowly, one panic episode at a time, one sleepless night at a time, one moment of staying when others couldn't. Till eventually Suyun began looking for Hana first during fear, and Hannah had been too emotionally attached to step back properly. A soft knock came at her door. Daniel entered quietly. "He's leaving." Hannah nodded without speaking. Daniel watched her carefully. "You still care about what happens to them?" "Him?" "No, the little girl." Hannah closed her eyes briefly. That answer was obvious. Daniel sat beside her. "You know returning changes everything." "I know. You won't survive going back as just staff anymore." That truth settled heavily between them, because emotional lines had already blurred beyond repair. Not romantically, not inappropriately, but deeply humanly. And once people become emotionally necessary to each other, pretending otherwise becomes dangerous. Back at the mansion, Ji-yun found Soo-yun sitting beside the front window again, waiting. The child had started doing that every evening around sunset, as if some part of her still expected Hana to walk through the gates. Ji-yun sat beside her quietly. Daddy went to see her today. Soo-yun looked up immediately. Why? Ji-yun hesitated. Because he finally understands some things. The child absorbed that silently, then whispered, "Too late hurts too." Ji-yun nearly cried again. Because children understood timing emotionally in ways adults ignored constantly. Love arriving late still leaves scars. That night, Soo-yun's condition worsened. Around midnight, Ji-yun heard movement upstairs and rushed into the hallway. Soo-yun stood near the staircase, trembling violently, disoriented, half awake. "Honey?" The child's breathing came too fast. "I can't." She suddenly collapsed against the wall. Ji-yun caught her immediately. Min-jae, within minutes, chaos filled the mansion. Medical staff arrived. Blood pressure checks, questions, lights. But through all of it, Soo-yun repeated only one thing weakly. "Don't let her disappear." The doctor eventually pulled Min-jae aside. "She's severely dehydrated." His stomach dropped instantly. "She's not eating enough," the doctor continued carefully. "And emotionally, she's under acute stress." Min-jae looked toward his daughter's room. "She needs stability immediately." The doctor hesitated before finishing. "And honestly, she may associate emotional safety with someone no longer present again." The same truth, repeated by everyone now, impossible to escape. At 2:40 a.m., Min-jae sat alone in the hospital waiting area after Soo-yun was admitted for observation. Sterile white lighting, everything cold. Ji-yun sat nearby silently crying into folded tissues. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Min-jae whispered, "I thought providing was enough." Ji-yun looked at him slowly. "That's how we were raised." He laughed bitterly. "And now our daughter thinks love disappears when she becomes difficult." The sentence nearly broke both of them, because somewhere across generations, emotional absence had quietly become normalized. Fathers worked, mothers performed stability, children adapted silently, until one child finally collapsed loudly enough for everyone to notice. Around dawn, Min-jae left the hospital briefly and drove back across the city, not to the mansion, to Hana again. This time when Daniel opened the restaurant door. He looked exhausted instead of angry. "She's in the back." Min-jae froze slightly. "Why?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Because the little girl's in the hospital." Upstairs, Hana stood immediately when Min-jae entered the apartment. Her face lost color instantly. "What happened?" She collapsed. The words barely left his mouth before Hana grabbed her coat. But Min-jae spoke again. "She kept asking for you." Hana stopped moving. Silence filled the tiny apartment. Then quietly, "Is she okay? She will be." A painful pause. "But she doesn't trust that." Hana turned away sharply, pressing trembling fingers against her mouth. For the first time since leaving the mansion, her composure cracked completely. Not because she blamed herself, because part of her feared Soo-yun experienced this separation exactly like abandonment, and that possibility was unbearable. Min-jae watched her carefully, then finally said the sentence he should have said long ago. "I didn't know what you were carrying alone." Hana laughed softly through tears, not mocking. "Just tired, that's the problem." She looked at him finally. "You never asked." The truth hit harder than anger would have. Min-jae lowered his eyes. "You're right." Hana stared at him in silence. And for the first time since they met, he no longer looked like a powerful executive. Just a man confronting the damage his emotional distance created. He swallowed carefully. "I thought professionalism meant boundaries." Hana shook her head softly. No, her eyes filled again. "Professionalism means children don't become emotionally dependent on one exhausted person because their parents are emotionally unavailable." The room went completely still, because finally, someone said it directly. No softened language, no polite avoidance, just truth. Min-jae accepted every word without defending himself, because deep down he already knew. Hana sat slowly on the edge of the couch. "I tried to step back gradually." Her voice cracked slightly. She panicked every time. A pause. "So I stayed longer." Min-jae listened silently. I told myself it was temporary. Another pause. But children don't measure love temporarily. Tears slid quietly down her face. I should have forced healthier boundaries earlier. Min Jae frowned immediately. No, Hana looked exhausted. You don't understand. She pressed trembling hands together. She trusted me because I stayed. A painful silence. And I stayed because nobody else consistently did. The honesty hollowed the room. Because for the first time, both adults fully confronted the same terrible reality together. Hana had become emotionally central not through manipulation, but through repeated acts of presence. And absence always loses eventually against presence. Several hours later, Hana finally entered Soo-Yun's hospital room quietly. The child looked impossibly small beneath white blankets. Machines beeped softly nearby. Ji-eun stood immediately upon seeing Hana. No jealousy remained now, only relief. Raw relief. Hana approached the bedside carefully. For a second, she simply stood there looking at the child she had tried so hard not to love too deeply. Then softly, Soo-Yun. The little girl's eyes opened slowly, disoriented at first, then suddenly clear. Hannah? The voice sounded fragile. Hannah immediately took her hand. I'm here. And just like that, the child's entire body relaxed for the first time in days. Not dramatically, not magically, just visibly, like fear itself loosened slightly inside her chest. Min Jae watched from the corner of the room silently, and the sight destroyed him completely, because no business achievement in his entire life had ever made his daughter look that safe. The hospital room stayed quiet long after Soo-Yun fell asleep again. Nobody wanted to disturb the fragile calm settling around her. Hana still sat beside the bed, one hand resting lightly against the child's fingers, while the heart monitor pulsed softly nearby. Across the room, Ji-Yoon watched silently, not threatened anymore, just painfully aware. Because for the first time, she could clearly see the emotional architecture of her daughter's safety. And most of it had been built by someone else. Min Jae stood near the window staring out at the pale Seoul sunrise. Exhaustion sat heavily across his face, but underneath the exhaustion was something new, humility, the dangerous kind. The kind people only gain after realizing they were wrong for a very long time. A doctor entered quietly around 6 in the morning. She's stabilizing, he said softly. Relief passed visibly through the room, but the doctor continued carefully. Emotionally, however, the situation cannot continue the same way. Everyone understood immediately the dependency, the instability, the emotional confusion. The doctor looked toward Hana respectfully. You clearly became an important attachment figure. Hana lowered her eyes. But the child also needs emotional security from her parents consistently. A pause. Not only during crisis, Min Jae nodded slowly. I understand. The doctor studied him carefully, almost measuring whether he truly did. Then finally, children recover from fear when adults become emotionally predictable. That sentence followed all three adults long after the doctor left. Because predictability sounded simple, yet somehow none of them had truly provided it. Not fully. Later that morning, Soo-Yun woke properly. Her eyes immediately searched the room and landed on Hannah. The child relaxed instantly, then slowly noticed her parents sitting nearby too. A complicated expression crossed her small face, not anger, uncertainty, like she no longer knew who might disappear next. Hana noticed immediately. So did Ji-Yoon. Min Jae moved his chair slightly closer. How are you feeling? Soo-Yun shrugged weakly. Tired, Min Jae swallowed carefully. I'm sorry, Soo-Yun looked confused by the apology at first, then looked down at the blanket. You were busy. The sentence returned again, always calmly, always honestly, and every time it cut deeper. Min Jae leaned forward slowly. I thought work was helping this family. Soo-Yun picked quietly at the blanket thread. Hannah stayed even when she was tired. Silence, no accusation attached, just comparison. And comparison spoken by children often reveal truths adults spend years avoiding. 2 days later, Soo-Yun returned home. But nothing inside the mansion functioned the same anymore. The emotional illusion had shattered too completely. Min Jae started coming home earlier, not once, repeatedly. Ji-Yoon canceled several gallery appearances. Family meals became mandatory. No phones allowed. At first, the changes felt awkward, artificial, like strangers attempting to imitate closeness. Soo-yun noticed that too. One evening during dinner, Min-jae tried asking about school. The child answered politely but briefly. Ji-yoon attempted conversation next. Same result. But when Hannah casually asked, "What happened to the plant experiment?" Soo-yun immediately began speaking for nearly 3 straight minutes. Detailed, animated, alive, the room fell quiet listening to her. Because they suddenly realized how much personality their daughter had been hiding beneath silence all these years. After dinner, Ji-yoon stood alone washing dishes while Hannah dried plates beside her. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. Finally, Ji-yoon whispered, "I used to resent you." Hannah looked up quietly. Ji-yoon laughed weakly. "I thought my daughter preferred you because I failed somehow." Hannah answered honestly. She preferred consistency, the truth stung. But Ji-yoon accepted it now. Tears filled her eyes suddenly. "I loved her, I know. Then why did she feel alone?" Hannah hesitated carefully. "Because some truths required gentleness. Love and emotional presence aren't always the same thing." Ji-yoon covered her face briefly. The sentence sounded devastating precisely because it was true. A week later, the family began therapy together. Not performative sessions, real ones, uncomfortable ones. Dr. Seo asked difficult questions no one could avoid anymore. "What did emotional support look like in your childhood?" Min-jae answered first. "My father provided everything materially and emotionally." Long silence. "He believed emotions created weakness." Dr. Seo nodded slowly, then turned toward Ji-yoon. "My mother cared deeply," Ji-yoon whispered. "But appearances mattered more than feelings." Again, another inherited pattern. Dr. Seo finally looked towards Soo-yun. "What about you?" The child thought carefully before answering. "I never wanted them perfect." The room became still. "I just wanted them to stay longer." Ji-yoon began crying quietly. Because children almost never ask for as much as adults assume. Usually they ask for time, attention, consistency, small things, repeated consistently. Meanwhile, consequences spread further outside the household. A private article leaked details about Min-jae's absence during his daughter's hospitalization years earlier. Online criticism intensified rapidly. Commentators questioned corporate culture, work obsession, emotional neglect among elite families. One board member confronted Min-jae directly during a tense meeting. "You're becoming emotionally distracted." Min-jae stared at the man coldly. "No," a pause. "I'm becoming emotionally present." The room fell silent instantly, because for the first time in years, he no longer sounded afraid of vulnerability. And strangely enough, that frightened the board more than his anger ever had. Back at the mansion, Hannah finally made her decision clear. She would not return as full-time caregiver. The conversation happened privately between her and Min-jae in the library one rainy evening. He nodded slowly after hearing her answer. "I understand." Hannah looked relieved he didn't argue. "I care about her too much to continue the same dynamic." Min-jae lowered his eyes briefly. "You're right." Silence settled between them comfortably this time. Not hostile, not defensive. Just honest. Finally, Min-jae asked quietly, "Did you ever hate us?" Hannah looked genuinely surprised. "No, even after everything," she thought carefully. "I think both of you loved your daughter." A pause. "You just assumed love could survive on intention alone." The sentence stayed with him, because intention had become his favorite excuse for years. "I meant well. I worked for them. I provided." Meanwhile, his daughter learned emotional survival from someone else entirely. That same night, Soo-yun overheard part of the conversation from the hallway. Not every word, just enough. Enough to understand Hannah was leaving eventually. Again, fear returned immediately. Later, Hannah found the child sitting quietly on the staircase, hugging her knees. "You're leaving?" Not a question. Hannah sat beside her slowly. Yes, a pause. "But not disappearing." Soo-yun's eyes filled instantly. "People say that." Hansa's heart nearly broke. Because once children experience emotional inconsistency repeatedly, promises stop feeling reliable. So Hannah chose honesty instead. "I can't stay forever in one house." The child stared downward silently. But Hannah continued softly, "I can still love you without living here." Suyun looked uncertain. Really, yes, the child absorbed that carefully, because this was new emotional territory. Love without abandonment, distance without disappearance. Hannah gently touched her hair. And your parents are learning too. Suyun whispered the fear she had hidden for years. What if they become busy again? Hannah answered honestly. Then you tell them immediately. A pause. You don't stay silent anymore. The child nodded slowly, not fully convinced, but listening, that mattered. Over the following weeks, rebuilding happened quietly. Not through dramatic speeches, through repetition. Min Jae attending school events. Jian reading bedtime stories badly but consistently. Family breakfasts becoming normal instead of ceremonial. At first, Suyun remained cautious emotionally, testing them constantly in small, invisible ways. Would they cancel? Would they leave early? Would work interrupt again? Sometimes fear still won. Sometimes she withdrew again. But slowly, the answer started changing. One evening during dinner, Suyun pushed her food around thoughtfully before suddenly asking, "Can everyone sit until I finish eating?" The room went quiet, because they all understood what she was really asking. Stay. Min-jae immediately set down his phone. Face down, Ji-yoon moved her untouched tea aside. Hana smiled softly from across the table. And for the first time since the story began, Soo-yeon picked up her spoon willingly, without fear controlling her hands. Not because everything was healed, because healing had finally started honestly. Healing did not arrive all at once. That was the first honest thing all of them learned. There was no magical morning where Soo-yeon suddenly became fearless. No dramatic speech that repaired years of emotional distance overnight. Some days still went badly. Some nights, she still checked the hallway twice before sleeping. Sometimes Min-jae still reached for his phone during dinner without realizing it. Sometimes Ji-yoon slipped back into old habits and filled silence with distractions instead of presence. But now, someone noticed, and more importantly, someone corrected it. That changed everything. Because emotional neglect often survives through invisibility. Once seen clearly, it becomes harder to repeat unconsciously. 3 months later, the Kang mansion felt different, not warmer exactly, more honest. The staff laughed occasionally now. Music played during breakfast. Several rooms once used only for appearances finally looked lived in. And Soo-yeon spoke more. Not constantly, but naturally. Like someone slowly learning her feelings no longer needed permission to exist. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Min-jae sat alone in his car outside a modest apartment building across the city. He stared at the steering wheel for nearly 2 minutes before finally stepping out. The building looked old, unremarkable, nothing like the environments he normally entered. But he recognized it immediately. His father's apartment. They had barely spoken properly in years. Not after business disagreements. Not after emotional distance hardened into habit. Min-jae knocked once, a long pause before the door opened. Chairman Kang looked older than Min-jae remembered. Still dignified. Still emotionally unreadable. "You came unexpectedly," Min-jae nodded once. "So did you." The older man stepped aside silently. Inside, the apartment felt painfully quiet. Minimal furniture, no family photographs visible, no warmth. Suddenly, Min-jae understood something he had never fully confronted before. His father had provided everything materially too, and somehow still ended up alone. The realization frightened him. Tea sat untouched between them for several minutes before Chairman Kang finally spoke. "You look tired," Min-jae laughed quietly. "I think I finally noticed something." His father waited. Min-jae stared at the steam rising from the tea. "I've silence, not hostile, just devastatingly accurate." The older man looked away first. And somehow that tiny reaction revealed more emotion than Min-jae had seen from him in decades. "My father was worse," Chairman Kang admitted quietly. The confession surprised him. "We were taught survival first." A pause. "Feelings later." Min-jae lowered his eyes. "And if later never comes," neither man answered, because both already knew. Across the city, Ji-yeon sat inside Hannah's apartment, helping prepare dinner, while Soo-yeon worked carefully on homework nearby. The arrangement looked strange from the outside. Not employer and employee anymore. Not exactly family either. something more complicated, more human. Ji-yoon chopped vegetables awkwardly, while Hana corrected her knife grip with quiet amusement. You hold it like you're negotiating with it. Ji-yoon laughed despite herself. I grew up with staff, I noticed. The honesty made both women smile softly. For months, their relationship had carried guilt, resentment, admiration, and discomfort all tangled together. But now something calmer existed between them. Recognition, not of perfection, of effort. Ji-yoon glanced toward Soo-yeon quietly. She laughs more around us now. Hana followed her gaze. Yes, a pause. She trusts that people are staying. Ji-yoon swallowed hard. That sentence still hurts. It should. Not cruelly said, just truthfully. Ji-yoon nodded slowly. Then after several moments, thank you for not teaching her to hate us. Hana looked genuinely surprised. She never wanted to hate you. That answer nearly made Ji-yoon cry again. Because children naturally reach toward parents even after disappointment. Adults often mistake silence for emotional independence when it's actually hope trying not to break. Later that evening, Soo-yeon sat cross-legged on the floor coloring while the adults talked nearby. Suddenly she looked up at Hana. Are you still leaving Korea? The room quieted instantly. Because Hana had finally received an international pediatric care opportunity in Canada weeks earlier. A major opportunity, better pay, better future, and everyone knew it, including Soo-yeon. Hana answered carefully. I might. The child nodded slowly like she had been preparing herself for the answer. No panic this time, just sadness, progress. Will you forget me? Hana immediately moved closer. No. Hana smiled softly. Because love isn't memory practice, a pause. It stays even when people move. Soo-yeon considered that seriously, then quietly asked, even far away? Yes. The child lowered her eyes toward the coloring book. When you left before, her voice became smaller. I thought maybe difficult people get abandoned. The sentence hollowed the room. Because finally, after all these months, the deepest fear underneath everything surfaced clearly. Not fear of loneliness. Fear of being too emotionally exhausting to keep. Hana gently lifted the child's chin. Listen carefully to me. Soo-yeon looked up. You were never difficult for needing comfort. Tears filled the child's eyes instantly. Hana continued softly, you were hurting. A pause. And hurting children deserve support, not abandonment. Ji-yoon covered her mouth quietly across the room. Even Min-jae looked away briefly. Because no one had ever said the truth that directly before. Not to Soo-yeon, not even to themselves. The child whispered shakily, then why did everybody leave so much? Silence settled heavily again. This time Min-jae answered first, not defensively, not carefully, honestly. Because we confused working hard with loving well. Soo-yeon stared at him quietly. And now, Min-jae's voice cracked slightly. Now I'm learning those are not always the same thing. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then something small but important happened. Soo-yeon stood from the floor slowly, walked across the room, and leaned carefully against her father's side. Not fully, not dramatically, tentatively, like someone testing emotional ground that once felt unsafe. Min-jae held perfectly still, because he understood how fragile trust looked while rebuilding. His hand rested gently against her shoulder. And this time, he stayed present inside the moment instead of reaching for distraction. A week later, Hana stood alone inside Incheon Airport holding her passport. Rain tapped softly against the giant windows while travelers moved endlessly around her. Her flight announcement echoed faintly overhead. Canada, a new beginning, a healthier boundary, maybe even happiness. But in her coat pocket sat a folded drawing Soo-yeon gave her earlier that morning. 3 figures holding hands again. This time, however, there were no empty spaces. At the bottom, written carefully in English, people can stay different ways. Hana stared at the drawing for a long moment, then slowly smiled through tears, because finally, the child understood the truth all the adults had spent the entire story learning too. Love is not proven by never leaving. It is proven by never making someone feel emotionally abandoned when distance comes necessary. 6 months later, winter returned to Seoul quietly. Snow drifted across the city in soft white layers, while warm lights glowed behind apartment windows and storefront glass. Inside the Kang mansion, things no longer looked quite as perfect as before, and somehow, that made the house feel more alive. Soo-yun's school drawings now covered part of the refrigerator. Books sat open in the living room. A half-finished scarf Ji-yoon kept trying to knit badly rested on the couch. The mansion finally carried evidence of people actually living inside it, not just performing happiness inside it. Downstairs, Min-jae adjusted the sleeves of a simple gray sweater while checking the oven nervously. "You're burning it again," Ji-yoon said from the dining table. "I'm not. You absolutely are. I followed the instructions." Ji-yoon laughed softly. "That's what worries me." The sound still surprised both of them sometimes. Not because laughter disappeared before, because genuine ease had. Now it appeared in small moments unexpectedly. Soo-yun entered the kitchen, carrying chopsticks too large for her hands. "Can I help?" Min-jae immediately stepped aside. "Yes." The child climbed carefully onto a chair and began arranging bowls across the table with deep concentration. Not perfectly aligned, not elegant, but personal. Ji-yoon watched quietly from across the room. Months earlier, dinner inside this house had felt ceremonial, cold, temporary. Now meals took longer because people actually stayed at the table. That difference mattered more than luxury ever did. Min-jae glanced at the clock again. Soo-yun noticed immediately. "She'll come." The child sounded calm saying it now. That alone felt miraculous. No panic, no trembling fear, just trust. Because over the past months, something important had slowly changed inside her. People still left rooms, still traveled, still became busy sometimes. But now they returned when they said they would. Consistency. The thing she needed most had finally become real. A soft knock echoed through the hallway. Soo-yun looked up instantly, then smiled, not desperately, happily. Ji-yoon opened the front door. Cold winter air slipped briefly into the house, and there stood Hana. Dark coat dusted lightly with snow, small overnight bag beside her leg. Tired smile warming slowly as she stepped inside. For a second, nobody moved. Then Soo-yun ran toward her, not panicked, not clinging, just joyful. Hannah knelt immediately and wrapped her arms around the child tightly. "You got taller. That's because you left for 1,000,000 years." Hana laughed softly. "It was 3 months, same thing." Even Min-jae smiled at that. When Hana finally stood again, the room became briefly awkward in a very human way. Because relationships had changed too much to fit old labels anymore. Employee no longer made sense. Guest felt wrong. Family sounded complicated. But maybe not every important relationship needed a perfect definition. Ji-yoon stepped forward first. "You came." Hannah nodded gently. "I promised." Simple words. But this time, everyone understood the weight inside them. Promises meant more now. Because they had all learned what broken consistency could do to a child. Min-jae approached last. For a moment, neither spoke. Then quietly, sincerely, "Thank you." Hana looked at him carefully. Not the way she used to, not cautiously, not professionally, just honestly. "For what?" Min-jae glanced towards Soo-yun, laughing softly while fixing the crooked bowls on the table. Then back at Hannah. "For staying long enough for us to realize what we were failing to see." The room fell quiet. Hannah lowered her eyes briefly. "She already loved both of you." Min-jae nodded slowly. "I know," a pause. "We just finally learned how to stay where love could actually reach her." Ji-yoon turned away quickly after that sentence. Emotional again, not from shame this time, relief. Because healing had not erased the damage completely, but it had transformed the family honestly. And honest healing lasts longer than perfect appearances. Dinner that night lasted nearly 2 hours. Nobody rushed. Nobody checked work messages. Nobody disappeared halfway through the meal. Soo-yun talked the most. About school, about art class, about a science project involving plants she was suddenly obsessed with. At one point, Hana looked quietly around the table, while the family laughed over one of Min-jae's failed cooking attempts. Then something softened in her expression, not pride exactly, peace. Because for the first time since entering their lives, Soo-yun no longer looked emotionally responsible for keeping herself safe alone. The burden had finally shifted back where it belonged, onto the adults. Later that evening, after dishes were cleared and snow continued falling outside, Soo-yun carried hot tea carefully toward the table. Very carefully. Tongue slightly sticking out from concentration. Everyone watched nervously. The cup shook once, then steadied. Finally, she placed it successfully in front of Hana. I made it myself. Hana smiled warmly. Thank you. Soo-yun climbed back into her chair proudly, then looked slowly around the table, at her mother, at her father, at Hana. Everyone still there, still listening, still present. The child smiled softly to herself, and this time, nobody left the table. That one moment, so small, so quiet, carried the weight of everything that came before it. Not a grand apology, not a dramatic speech, just people choosing to stay. Finally learning that love is not proven by how much you provide. It is proven by how present you are willing to become. Hana never asked to be anyone's safe place. She simply stayed when staying was hard. And in doing so, she showed an entire family what they had been missing. Not each other, but themselves. That is the kind of love that does not announce itself. It just shows up again and again, until the people it surrounds finally begin to feel safe enough to grow. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of someone who stayed when others couldn't, or someone you wish had stayed, leave a comment below and tell me, what was the moment that broke you open? Was it the drawings, the recordings, the little girl who stopped eating not out of stubbornness, but out of grief? Tell me, because stories like this one only mean something when they find the right people. And if you are here, watching until the very end, you are exactly the right person. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications, because Afro K Chronicles is not just a channel. It is a space where stories that get ignored find the audience they deserve. Stories about love that crosses borders, about belonging that defies expectation, about the quiet, powerful people who change lives without ever being asked to. Hannah's story does not end here. There is more coming. And you do not want to arrive late to what happens next. Share this video with one person today. Just one. Someone who needs to be reminded that presence is the most powerful thing a human being can offer another. We will see you in the next one.